Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. My name is Sergeant David Willis. I serve with the Chicago Police Department, assigned to a special protective detail that was assembled a few months ago. Back then, we'd heard rumors of an unusual infection cropping up around Midway Airport. The initial reports were so strange, most of us just shook our heads. We thought it was a hoax or a misunderstanding, some new strain of flu that had gotten exaggerated by local news outlets. We were told to remain calm and wait for official information. Then, as days passed, entire blocks near the airport started to go silent. That's when the city locked everything down, section by section. Only a handful of outsiders or official personnel knew the full extent of the outbreak. When the governor signed the order for a large-scale quarantine, it was like nothing we'd ever seen. Suddenly, the southwestern part of the city was cordoned off with concrete barriers, chain-link fences, and armed checkpoints manned by the National Guard. People who were inside the quarantine zone had no way out. People who were outside couldn't get in, even if they had family, friends, or property on the other side. The infection spread fast, too fast for our standard protocols. At first we called those infected individuals the stricken, but the nickname changed almost weekly. Lurchers, no-lifers, hollows. They were effectively the walking dead, though no official statement ever used that term. Medical teams tried to label the condition something clinical, but the official name never stuck in public. People preferred the blunt clarity of zombie, even though that word was usually reserved for movies. In time, we all realized it was the only word that felt accurate. My unit received the call to relocate to the quarantine zone perimeter after a month of citywide panic. Each passing day, we heard new instructions about what to watch for, how to respond, and which areas were considered lost. It felt unreal. I spent years in law enforcement, dealt with armed suspects and intense standoffs, but I'd never faced anything like this. When we arrived at the perimeter, I saw the scale of the operation. Large walls rose up around a wide swath of the southwest side, from near Cicero Avenue all the way to a heavily fortified barrier around the neighborhoods close to Midway. Military vehicles circled the area, with bright floodlights trained on the streets beyond. Soldiers manned the outer perimeter. Meanwhile, my team and I were inside that ring, in what was supposed to be the safe buffer zone. The plan was to keep watch over a secondary set of barricades that protected still occupied residential blocks and critical infrastructure, like local hospitals, fire stations, and utility hubs. The quarantine zone was not just a single street or a handful of buildings. We're talking a swath of Chicago that once teemed with families, small businesses, schools, and a lifetime of memories. Now, it was eerily quiet, except for the sporadic sound of helicopter rotors or the hum of generators. Occasionally, one might catch a glimpse of movement in the distance, shadows crossing through empty windows or silhouettes wandering behind abandoned cars. At the far edge, the National Guard had set up massive floodlights that swept across deserted intersections all night. Some nights, nothing would happen. Other nights, the lights caught sight of shambling figures that looked human but moved in a jerky, uncoordinated way. They told us the infection was believed to be a mutated viral agent. Official memos stated that it traveled through bodily fluids, primarily via biting or direct contact with open wounds. Once infected, a person would show flu-like symptoms, followed by delirium. Then came the final stage, a state of relentless aggression, responding only to basic instincts: hunger, movement, and searching for the uninfected. At the time, all we had were second-hand stories from the initial wave of incidents inside the core of the quarantine zone. The accounts were chaotic, incomplete. Neighbors describing unusual behavior, someone attacking a paramedic, or local shop owners banging on police station doors after someone in the store just wouldn't go down, no matter what the employees did. Many of those early calls got lost in the shuffle of official confusion, and by the time we realized how serious it was, entire streets had gone dark. I remember the day we first encountered them directly. My partner, Officer Brandon Morales, and I had been assigned to a roving patrol in a specialized SUV designated Unit Sierra 84. It was heavily reinforced, outfitted with slatted steel over the windows, plus an upgraded engine. Our orders were to drive through an area of deserted commercial buildings near the Midway Orange Line stop, see if there were any signs of survivors, and radio back anything significant. We didn't expect much. By then, the place had been under quarantine for nearly 2 months, and most folks had either been evacuated or had vanished altogether. We were about 6 blocks from the station when our spotlight caught sight of something moving up ahead. Brandon cut the engine, and the SUV rolled to a stop. We used the side-mounted lamp to scan the sidewalk. That's when we saw them. 5 or 6 individuals, their clothing torn and dusty. I flipped the switch on the loudspeaker and began the usual protocol, instructing them to raise their hands, to identify themselves if they could. Nothing. Their bodies jerked in unnatural motions. One leaned against a rusted sedan, while another dragged a battered leg. From inside the vehicle, I could see they were colorless, as if every bit of life had drained from them. And their eyes. It was as though they barely recognized the beam shining on them. They turned in our direction, but not with any sense of awareness that we were officers. Instead, they advanced slowly, as if drawn by the sound of our engine and the glare of the spotlight. When one of them stepped closer, I recalled a briefing from the CDC liaison. They show no pain response. Standard non-lethal methods are usually ineffective. Head trauma appears to be the only consistent method to neutralize a threat. That briefing had seemed like a wild exaggeration at the time. Brandon looked over at me, and we shared a silent acknowledgement. We both knew we were about to see what so many others had described: the unstoppable approach, the vacant stare, the total disregard for normal human interaction. They were no longer people in any sense we recognized. They were husks driven by primal impulses. We repeated our warning. No change. Then, the moment we stepped out, they accelerated toward us, still limping and swaying, but now with an added burst of hostility. Brandon shouted a final warning, then took a shot with his service rifle, an M4 variant that had been issued specifically for the quarantine detail. The first creature staggered but kept moving. A second round to the head dropped it instantly. By the time we realized the rest were unfazed by the shots, they were nearly upon us. We had to move fast. Brandon reached for the SUV door, while I kept my sidearm raised, a standard-issue Glock 17. Another infected lunged. I fired a single round at its forehead. It went down. The others kept coming from different angles, forcing us to maneuver around the SUV in a tight circle to keep them all in view. Every new shot echoed down the empty streets, stirring a few crows that flapped away from a nearby rooftop. When the final infected collapsed, we stood there for a long moment, scanning the street for any further movement. That was the first time it truly hit me. These were once residents, neighbors, maybe even folks who had come to Chicago for a visit. Now they were something else entirely, beyond reason or empathy. The unsettled feeling never left me after that. Of course, I tried to appear calm for Brandon, who, for all his tough exterior, had a haunted look in his eyes. After that incident, we reported back to the command post near Archer Avenue. A lieutenant from the National Guard listened grimly to our account. He told us about sightings of bigger groups, sometimes numbering in the dozens. He described how one group had managed to knock over a chain-link fence through sheer numbers. From the looks of it, the quarantine zone was teetering on the edge of a major breach. We started calling them Zeds informally, partly because it was faster to say over the radio, and partly because it was less personal than calling them people. For the next few weeks, the city enforced even stricter protocols. Additional shipping containers were brought in to reinforce the perimeter. Razor wire and concrete blocks began to pile up. Helicopters flew overhead day and night, dropping supplies for the troops on the outskirts. Meanwhile, police units like mine patrolled deeper inside, scanning the deserted streets and reporting any larger gatherings of the infected. Sometimes we'd find only a few wandering husks. Other times, we'd discover entire knots of them clustering around certain buildings. The presence of any living person seemed to draw them in like a beacon. Residents still living in the safe sections of the quarantine zone had grown more nervous. Some folks tried to keep their routines, walking dogs and jogging in the early mornings, convinced they could avoid trouble. Others rarely left their apartments, relying on government-issued rations distributed at local precinct stations or community centers. We'd help coordinate those distributions, handing out bottled water and MREs to people with haggard faces and trembling hands. They'd ask us for news from outside, desperate to know if a cure was anywhere on the horizon. Official statements always had the same message. The infection was still under investigation, and the situation was under control. Yet behind the scenes, we heard about entire counties in other states that had gone quiet. The National Guard presence in Chicago multiplied. I began seeing convoys of Humvees on a daily basis. Along the perimeter, teams set up watchtowers with high-powered scopes. From what I could gather, the government feared that if the infected ever breached these walls in large numbers, it would be nearly impossible to hold the city. Then, in the 4th month of the quarantine, the worst happened. My precinct was mobilized to relocate hundreds of civilians from an apartment complex near 63rd Street. There were reports of a huge cluster of infected, approaching from the other side of the Orange Line train tracks. The plan was to bring in busloads of families to a safer part of the city, behind multiple layers of barricades. I was assigned to work with a squad of National Guard troops and local officers to facilitate the evacuation. We had bulletproof buses lined up, each with a steel cage over the windshield. The operation was scheduled for dawn. Everything seemed orderly at first. Residents, who had been warned the previous night, were lined up on the sidewalk by 6 a.m., carrying backpacks, suitcases, or just plastic grocery bags with whatever essentials they could stuff inside. The mood was tense, but most people cooperated. A few refused to leave, convinced their apartments were safer than the unknown situation elsewhere. But the majority just wanted to go someplace they believed was still under government control. We were loading the 4th bus when a soldier on the perimeter radioed in that he saw movement. A large group of infected, at least 50, were spotted 4 blocks away, converging on our location. The order came immediately: expedite the loading process and prepare to defend the position. Officers began ushering the last stragglers onto the buses. A mother with 2 small children stumbled, nearly dropping her toddler, before a National Guard private helped them climb aboard. The tension in the air felt electric. A distant rumble suggested that something was approaching, maybe the echo of shuffling feet against pavement. Then we saw them. They emerged from behind a line of abandoned storefronts, numbers far exceeding the original estimate. Some still wore tattered business suits, others hospital gowns. A few looked so decayed that it was impossible to guess their backgrounds. All marched at that uncanny, stumbling pace, yet with an unwavering focus in our direction. I joined a defensive line of officers armed with rifles, shotguns, and sidearms. Brandon was right beside me. Lips pressed so tightly together it seemed he didn't want to risk a single unnecessary breath. We waited for the command. Soon enough, the voice of a National Guard lieutenant cut across the radio announcing, "Hold until they're within optimum range. Aim for the head." That phrase, so matter-of-fact, still unsettled me, but we did as trained. The front rank of infected drew closer. An officer on my left signaled for the bus doors to shut. We heard the hiss of hydraulic doors, followed by the clank of metal latches. The buses were at capacity. This was our last stand before we had to retreat with the convoy. "Fire!" the lieutenant called out. A ragged volley of gunshots erupted. Muzzle flashes lit the morning haze like tiny strobe lights. The infected in the first row jerked backward or dropped to the ground, but those behind them advanced steadily. shell casings scattered across the asphalt. As we reloaded, the second wave pressed forward, stepping over the fallen. Officers who had been through this scenario before began methodically targeting heads. Soldiers with automatic rifles tried short bursts. I noticed how a few infected, even after taking multiple hits to the torso, would only pause or rock in place, then continue shuffling forward. They seemed oblivious to everything but our location. The formation was so massive that some of them had spread out along both sides of the street, trying to come around our flanks. I signaled to Brandon to cover the left side. He nodded, pivoted, and laid down precise rifle shots at any figure edging toward the side of the bus. Another CPD officer, Jenkins, held the right, shouting for me to watch the center. The noise was deafening, and the smell of spent gunpowder hung thick in the air. The infected were dangerously close now. Some were only a few yards from the front line, forcing us to aim quickly or risk being overwhelmed. A soldier near me tried to toss a flashbang, hoping to disorient the group, but it had little effect. They barely reacted to the burst of light and sound, as though their senses were dulled to everything but the presence of the living. Another soldier called out that they were running low on magazines. Suddenly, an alarming report came through from our rear guard. "They're coming from the alley." A second wave had looped around us, stumbling between buildings and creeping up behind the buses. One of the bus drivers radioed frantically that something was banging on the rear emergency exit door. In that instant, I realized we were close to being surrounded. Our plan had been to load everyone, hold off the infected from a single direction, then drive off. Now, the perimeter was compromised from multiple angles. The lieutenant screamed into the radio for the buses to start moving. The first bus lurched forward, swerving around parked cars. We heard the shriek of twisted metal as it sideswiped an abandoned truck, but it kept going. The second and third followed suit. That left the fourth bus, which was struggling to start. The engine whined, refusing to turn over. Inside, the silhouettes of terrified families could be seen huddling near the windows. Brandon and I sprinted toward it, covering the driver's side door as a cluster of infected closed in. A mechanic from the National Guard, a tall, stoic man named Carlyle, dashed to the front of the bus, wrenches clanging on his tool belt. He tried to open the engine compartment, but the infected were too close. He swung the compartment door shut and rushed back to the sidewalk. We couldn't hold this position. There were at least 100 infected converging from every direction. The soldier in charge radioed, "All units, pull back. Retreat to the fallback point at 55th. But that bus still wouldn't move. People inside hammered on the windows, their eyes wide with desperation. They saw us, but we had no way to push back the wave of infected. The few soldiers left behind were forming a small ring around the bus, firing rapidly. One inadvertently stepped too close to the broken curb and stumbled. Immediately, 2 infected were upon him, dragging him from sight. We never heard him utter a sound on the radio. Brandon yelled that we had to retreat or we'd be overrun. I hesitated, but it was clear that staying meant certain doom, for us and for everyone on that bus. Through the swirling chaos, I saw the driver slamming his fists against the steering wheel. Then, with a sudden belch of black smoke, the engine roared to life. A collective hope surged among us. The bus lurched ahead, just as the infected swarmed the vehicle. Several figures clung to the side, raking at the windows. The bus accelerated, tires squealing. I caught a glimpse of bodies being flung aside by the front grille. Then, with a final burst, the bus pushed through and sped down the block, weaving around debris. Brandon and I sprinted to our SUV, while the other soldiers scrambled to their vehicles. We raced out of there, knowing we had only seconds before the street was fully choked with the infected. Once we cleared the area and reached the fallback point at 55th, we regrouped with the rest of our unit. Miraculously, all 4 buses had made it, though the last one had sustained serious damage. The families inside were rattled but alive. We were given a moment to catch our bearings. Some officers attempted to calm frantic parents, who begged for an update, any update, on where they'd be taken next. A National Guard captain assured them that a larger convoy would lead them to a fortified shelter near the lakefront. The captain then turned to me and asked for a field report. I kept it short and grim. The area around 63rd was lost. We had no control there anymore. That was the day we learned the danger was no longer an isolated handful of infected. This was a tide, creeping ever closer to the outer walls. Within hours that news reached the top brass. All non-essential personnel were evacuated from the southwestern blocks of the quarantine zone, leaving only the National Guard and specialized police units to hold strategic intersections. Barricades were relocated, buildings were forfeited, roads were sealed off. The city had shrunk its defensive lines significantly, an admission of how dire the situation was. In the days that followed, the term hordes began circulating among us. Initially, we'd avoided that label. It sounded sensational, straight out of an apocalypse film, but it was the only word that did justice to their sheer numbers and the wave-like advance that we faced. From our vantage, it seemed unstoppable. Any time we neutralized a portion of them, more would appear from side streets and alleyways. I started hearing that the infection had broken out in other states too. New York, California, Texas. The entire country was imposing quarantines in major cities. The fear was that these areas would become epicenters for something that could spread nationwide, if not contained. Our government was coordinating with agencies around the globe to understand the infection, but progress was slow. Research labs worked around the clock to figure out if the infected could be saved, or if there was a cure. So far, there was no cure. Meanwhile, inside our own quarantine zone, life became a rotating cycle of patrols, defensive engagements, and hurried rescue missions. We slept in shifts at a converted high school turned staging area. Troops bunked in the old gym, and the halls were lined with weapons crates and equipment racks. At night, the floors shook from the sound of supply helicopters landing on the football field. Morale was stretched thin. I'd walk through the hallways and see exhausted faces. Men and women from the CPD, from the Illinois National Guard, from volunteer medical teams. Hardly anyone smiled. We stayed focused by clinging to our routines and remembering our duty. Some kept small tokens of normal life pinned to their gear, a photograph of a spouse, a child's drawing taped next to the pocket for spare magazines, a lucky coin. Each reminder silently declared why they fought to keep the infection contained. About 3 weeks into this new reality, rumors surfaced that the infected had begun showing up on the outer perimeter in large packs, bigger than anything we'd ever seen. Barricades that once seemed impenetrable were tested nightly. Guards reported seeing new behaviors. Some infected might stop to claw at razor wire or gather around a gate for hours. No one knew if they could learn or plan, but the effect was ominous. Then came the night of the Grand Breach, as it would later be called in official statements. It began with a sudden drop in the power grid around 10 p.m. We never learned if it was sabotage, a technical failure, or an overloaded system. In any case, the floodlights died at multiple key checkpoints. Generators tried to compensate, but the darkness was enough to embolden the infected. They converged on one of the weaker fence lines, near a run-down industrial park. The National Guard responded with ground teams, but the perimeter watchtowers had lost a significant chunk of their visibility. Within an hour, the infected had toppled or bent sections of the fence, flooding into the safe zone. We received the call at our staging area. My entire unit rushed to the motor pool, scrambling into our vehicles. I strapped on my Kevlar vest, clicked the safety off my rifle, and jumped into the passenger seat of the same SUV we'd used before. Brandon fired up the engine, and we tore out of there, joined by a convoy of more than a dozen heavily armored trucks. Over the radio, frantic voices described a wave of infected streaming past the barrier, heading deeper into the city. Soldiers on the ground were being pushed back block by block. When we arrived, the scene was pure chaos. In the dim glow of sporadic emergency lights, we spotted groups of infected surging around parked trucks. Some tried to climb onto the hood of a Humvee, while the soldiers inside fired relentlessly through the gun ports. Another group had smashed through the side entrance of a warehouse, from which we could hear muffled screams. Someone must have taken shelter in there. The strobe of muzzle flashes danced along the walls. The sense of dread was palpable. A single misstep or misjudgment, and any one of us could end up surrounded. We joined the line, forming a rough semicircle around the largest cluster of infected. Instructions crackled over the radio. We needed to contain them before they reached the residential blocks beyond. Otherwise, thousands more civilians would be in immediate danger. I aimed my rifle, focusing on the silhouettes. Each shot felt like a slow, deliberate choice in a split second of time. Pick a target, exhale, pull the trigger. I could see them drop one by one. But just as soon as one dropped, another took its place. Adrenaline surged through every officer and soldier present. Magazines were swapped in record time. At some point, there was a rallying call to push forward. A soldier with a bullhorn directed the vehicles to form a wedge. We advanced along a narrow street, pushing the infected back. The Humvees led the charge, ramming into the largest groups, while those on foot stayed close, firing in controlled bursts. Brandon steered our SUV behind a line of National Guard vehicles, occasionally swerving to avoid debris. Despite our best efforts, pockets of the infected leaked around the wedge formation. Over comms, we heard repeated calls for backup near a cluster of industrial buildings. We couldn't spare anyone, as every able body was engaged in holding the main line. Eventually, one of the watchtower teams reported that the horde's momentum had slowed. The wedge was making progress, forcing them into narrower side streets, where we could pick them off more efficiently. That tenuous victory was overshadowed by the knowledge that dozens, maybe hundreds of infected had already slipped through. They were now scattered in parts of the city that had previously been considered safe. Any illusions of a clean perimeter were shattered. Dispatch sent out a citywide alert. All units, the quarantine zone is compromised. Fall back to Tier 2. Repeat, fall back to Tier 2. Civilians in Tier 1 are advised to evacuate immediately. Tier 2 meant the next line of defense, a hardened perimeter about 10 blocks closer to downtown, protected by steel gates and guard towers set up along major thoroughfares like Western Avenue. Retreating meant abandoning all those neighborhoods. We'd effectively conceded a massive portion of Chicago's southwest side, handing it over to the infected. It was a bitter directive, but there was no choice. Over the next several hours, my unit helped guide any remaining civilians out of the compromised zone. We saw families fleeing in cars packed to the brim, mattresses tied to the roofs, as if that mattered in the face of this crisis. Others escaped on foot, pushing strollers or carrying small children. Officers and soldiers waved them through the newly erected checkpoints, instructing them to keep going east or north until they reached the official relocation centers. Sirens blared non-stop. In the distance, I glimpsed helicopters shining spotlights onto the swirling mass of infected that had fully claimed the area behind us. By sunrise, most of the streets near the new perimeter were jammed with vehicles, some abandoned mid-lane if they'd run out of fuel or broken down. Exhausted residents milled around, asking for directions. Tension spiked as rumors flew that the entire city might be next. The National Guard struggled to keep the crowd calm. We tried to set up a triage station in the parking lot of a grocery store, but supplies were already low. Field medics did their best with bandages and antiseptic. We saw a few suspicious wounds, and the protocol was strict. If anyone showed signs of infection, they had to be isolated immediately. Thus began a grueling routine of patrol, guard duty, and rescue operations within the new perimeter. The infected were out there in staggering numbers, just a few blocks away from places like Marquette Park and Gage Park, places we used to consider normal Chicago neighborhoods. Now they were menacing no-go zones. At times, we tried to coordinate with research teams who were gathering specimens. They'd request we secure an area long enough for them to dart in with specialized vehicles, capturing an infected individual for lab study. It felt surreal, standing guard while these scientists in thick protective suits wrestled one of the stricken into a containment pod. Each mission ended with us more convinced than ever that these creatures retained almost nothing of their humanity. Meanwhile, the world outside Chicago watched, horrified, as more cities encountered similar outbreaks. Some places fell so quickly, there was barely time to mobilize. Our city, ironically, was considered somewhat stable by comparison because we'd spent months fortifying. But those inside knew the truth. It was a slow collapse, one line of defense after another failing under the weight of endless infected. I remember one particularly harrowing mission when we attempted to secure a series of bus routes near Midway. It was supposed to be a humanitarian corridor, a last-ditch effort to reach anyone still stuck in the deeper parts of the quarantine zone. We found one bus with shattered windows, the driver's seat covered in dark stains. The entire interior was empty, except for scratch marks along the metal walls. That silence told its own chilling story. We radioed in the find, and the corridor was declared compromised. As the weeks went on, official communication from city leaders became sporadic. Curfews were announced, lifted, then re-announced. Every day, new fences were erected. Every day, more infected arrived at those fences. Military convoys rumbled through once thriving streets that now resembled a disaster movie set. People still living near the perimeter continued to rely on ration drops, though those were growing less frequent. My unit, battered by constant engagements, was down to half its original roster. Some had been reassigned, others had simply vanished in the chaos. Yet we kept going, spurred on by the glimmer of hope that we could keep the infection from swallowing the entire city. Perhaps help would arrive in the form of a cure, or a nationwide mobilization that could push these creatures back. Until then, we had a job: prevent the infection from spilling into Chicago's downtown core, no matter the cost. I'll never forget the moment I realized how truly desperate our situation had become. It was during one of the final sweeps along Archer Avenue, just a few blocks from the perimeter fence. Brandon and I stepped out of the SUV to investigate a faint distress call on the radio. The voice had been garbled, but we picked out something like, "Help, pin down, restaurant on Archer, basement." We found the place easily enough. A small diner with a neon sign that still flickered faintly. A chain was wrapped around the doors, but they were pried open. Inside, the counters had been toppled, chairs scattered. We spotted broken glass on the floor, plus scattered food supplies. A single flight of stairs led to a basement pantry. We called out, announcing ourselves, and got no answer. Then Brandon pointed to scuff marks that led down the stairs. I lifted my rifle, and we descended carefully. The basement was cramped and smelled of mildew. Shelves of canned goods lined the walls. In the far corner, we saw a door battered off its hinges. Beyond it lay a narrow storage room. We peered inside. That's where we found them, 3 infected, hunched over something on the floor. They were so focused on it that they didn't notice us at first. I couldn't make out what they were clustered over, but I had a sinking feeling. Brandon quietly raised his rifle. 3 silenced shots ended it. When we approached, we saw the remains of a man in a security guard uniform. His radio was on the ground, still crackling faintly. He'd likely been the one who called for help. The sight of him, clearly having fought to the last, drove home the horrifying reality that no place was safe anymore. We did what we could, radioed in that we'd found the source of the distress call, then left in heavy silence. Soon after, we heard through command channels that the city leadership was preparing a final fallback position near the Loop, reinforcing bridges across the Chicago River. They referred to it as Plan Iron Shield. The idea was to concentrate all remaining military, police, and volunteer forces around the downtown area and prevent the infected from crossing the river if the southwestern defenses fully collapsed. In effect, half the city was being abandoned. Some might have called it necessary triage. Others called it an unimaginable tragedy. I learned from an internal briefing that the infection was spreading faster in other regions too. Chicago wasn't the only hotspot. The entire country was in crisis. But our orders were clear. Hold your ground as long as possible. Prevent an all-out breach. Give the rest of the city a chance to fortify. Let the scientists search for an answer. Night after night, we heard the unsteady echoes of the infected roaming blocks that once bustled with cars and people. Sometimes, spotlights from helicopters revealed masses of them congregating around major intersections, drawn by sirens or distant gunfire. The city had transformed into a battleground, and it was uncertain which side would ultimately prevail. Through it all, I kept going because that's what police officers do. We serve and protect, even when the circumstances defy everything we once understood about the world. There were moments of rescue that lifted my spirits. Children reunited with frantic parents, or an elderly resident who had survived in a boarded-up apartment for weeks, grateful just to see another living face. Those encounters reminded me why we continued risking our lives. But the fear remained, unspoken, yet evident in every tense glance we shared. Our hands shook occasionally, not from cold, but from the knowledge that we could lose everything in an instant. When new recruits or volunteers joined us, they always carried that initial look of shock. They'd heard the rumors, now they saw the truth. At some point, the official statements on the city's main emergency channel began referencing Operation Long Night, a strategy to keep the southwestern zone from bleeding into the rest of Chicago. It meant we'd be receiving more reinforcements from other states. Yet each day, the tide of infected seemed to grow. We discovered that many had come from the suburbs and surrounding areas, drawn by the noise or the movement of the city. It became a revolving door of more and more infected funneling in. I'm not sure how this all ends. In fact, as I record these events, partly as a log, partly as a way to process the chaos, I acknowledge that I might not see the final outcome. What I do know is that we've held the line this long, even after the breach, even after losing so many neighborhoods. We've proven that humanity can push back, at least for a time. I've seen quiet acts of bravery every day, soldiers giving their last rations to a frightened teenager, medics forming a chain to carry wounded officers to safety, residents who, despite losing their homes, keep volunteering at shelters to feed others. This is the side of Chicago that gives me hope, even as the horizon seems dim. If you've read this far, I hope it conveys some sense of the reality we face. The infected are not just a scary story or a rumor. They're a relentless force. People who have lost themselves entirely to a strange and terrible condition. We call them Zeds, stricken, hollows, or simply the infected. But a rose by any other name, well, you know how that saying goes. The truth is, they're dangerously real. So that's where we stand. Battered squads of police and National Guard, patrolling the edges of a shrinking safe zone, with the outer perimeter lines barely holding. The city's entire southwestern region is effectively abandoned to the undead. The idea of a quick resolution has faded into a long, grueling ordeal of containment. The media calls it a quarantine, but that word lost meaning months ago. Now it's just a fight, a struggle for survival and for hope. Those of us left in this quarantine zone, those still here, still breathing, try not to dwell on the collapse of it all. Instead, we focus on the next call, the next mission. We check on each other, we reload our weapons, and we wait to hear where they need us next. As I finish this account, I'm getting ready to join another patrol. Brandon is outside the SUV, scanning the area, probably thinking about the same thing I am. How long can we keep this up? But we'll do it anyway, because that's who we are. We are Chicago's first line and last line of defense. We don't say out loud how tense we feel when we see silhouettes in the distance. We don't share how our hands can't stay steady when the next wave comes. But we still take up our positions on the barricades. We still load up into the SUVs for the next scouting run. And we still do what we can to keep people safe. Someday, maybe, there will be a cure. Maybe the world's scientists will figure this out, and the infected can be dealt with. Perhaps entire cities can heal. In the meantime, we stand our ground. If you're reading this, remember that we tried. Remember that the Chicago Police Department, the National Guard, and countless brave volunteers did everything we could to hold the line against something that no training manual ever prepared us for. This is Sergeant David Willis, Unit Sierra 84, Chicago Police Department. This is what it's like inside the quarantine. The zone is compromised, and we're still out here, on these streets, fighting an enemy that was once our own neighbors. Every day, the line between hope and despair feels razor thin, but we hold on. Because there's nothing else we can do. Because this city is home, and we're sworn to protect it, even as the entire world tilts into chaos around us. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.